climate change is a relatively new area of focus on the African continent, primarily because when it started really as a get-together of the developed countries who combined. They were responsible for the bulk of the emissions. So the focus on climate change was initially on how to reduce the emissions, and it still is. And so because Africa did not contribute much to these emissions, it was then thought that this was really a developed country issue, until we started connecting what was happening in Africa with climate change, and hence the realization that although Africa did not cause or contribute much to climate change, Africa suffers the brunt of the consequences of climate change, and hence our need to get involved in the global negotiations and also factor climate change into what we are doing at the national level. So we mobilized ourselves and managed to get some resources from development partners, including the EU, which resources enabled us to, first of all, do baseline check on what it obtains on the ground in our various member states. We did conduct several roundtable discussions in about 15 of our 26 countries in Eastern and Southern Africa. And it is out of this that we're able to put together the issues that are important at the national level and what needed to be taken up into the global negotiations through what we call the African Group of Negotiators. So our prime objective in our climate change interventions is to support our countries to address the impacts of climate change, and at the same time building economic and social resilience for present and future generations. And this is to be achieved through ensuring that the African group participates in a unified and well-coordinated manner at the UNFCCC negotiations. That means building a unified and common African position in these negotiations. This is what our consultations have been able to produce, and we've been working very closely with the African Group of Negotiators to make sure that the voice of Africa is heard at the global negotiations, and that the agreement that is going to come hopefully out of Paris next year will take into account the key concerns of Africa. "70 to 80% of the economies of Africa are agriculture or agriculture dependent. And even the bulk of our trade amongst each other is in agricultural produce or produce derived therefrom. And hence, a global agreement on climate change that leaves out agriculture has left Africa by the wayside. And agriculture in Africa is most climate dependent because 90-something% of agriculture in Africa depends on rainfall. There's very little irrigation, although there's lots of water. And so promoting climate resilient agriculture, or what we call climate smart agriculture, is a prime intervention on our part. If we can manage to organize our response strategy such that the private sector can come in and see new business opportunities or new profit opportunities out of addressing the climate change question, then we open our doors to virtually limitless source of investment. And this is where the green economy issues do come in, renewable energy, even in climate smart agriculture, how to mechanize our agriculture, how to promote irrigation, and many, many other green investments. If we can mobilize the private sector to come in, then more resources will be made available. And as you know, the resources that are available from government subventions or from donor funding are largely dependent on taxing people, whether it is in Africa or in Europe. And as you know, there is a limit to which governments can tax people before people start protesting. So the government subventions and the donor support, whilst welcome, I think there's a limit to how much we can go. But if we can open the doors to the private sector, there's a lot more resources that can be put at our disposal. I would look at it this way, that South Africa is attracting the bulk of funding is no surprise to us, because South Africa is arguably the largest economy on the African continent, although Nigeria is hard on its heels and may soon be overtaking South Africa. But South Africa is an industrial economy, and in terms of emissions, I think it is correct to say they are the largest single emitter on the African continent, and therefore they need to take this into account. And they are largely fossil fuel dependent. They don't have much hydroelectric potential, so but they have huge reserves of coal, and so they have to take that into account. And being a bigger economy, it is a more sophisticated economy. The projects there tend to be bigger, and to put together the requirements for you to access the funds for a bigger project, it takes the same amount of thinking and effort as putting together a project, a very tiny project. And many of the projects in sub-Saharan Africa, north of the Limpopo, tend to be very small. And hence, to mobilize and get funding for these, there's a lot of costs that have to be borne upfront. And this is one of the major reasons why there have been very few projects coming out of Africa. But if these can be coalesced, and this is how we're trying to address this, for instance, in COMESA, we have a carbon fund. The carbon fund now can develop this project preparation capacity so that we pick lots of similar projects in many countries, and we coalesce these, and to approach funders to support this becomes easier if we do it like that. All climate change interventions should be aimed at reducing the risk of disasters. And where disasters are unavoidable, they should be aimed at quickly normalizing the situation after disaster has struck. And it is a fact that if you get a cyclone or tornado, depending on where you are, we have examples of these that hit the United States. The United States is able to quickly recover from this. But in Africa, if you have a similar disaster, because of their structural and other weaknesses, they don't have the technology, the capacity, and the systems, it takes them a lot longer to recover from disasters. And therefore, disaster risk reduction or mitigation is much more crucial for Africa, because when you get a disaster like this, there are many more casualties compared to what would happen if a similar disaster was to strike the United States or to strike Europe. And so, yes, it is very important that we get to know who is vulnerable to what, how, where, when, and what options are there for these people. We look at the issue of disaster preparedness at various levels. At the very basic, it depends on the individual. The individual themselves need to know what they are vulnerable to and what they can do to themselves, rather than waiting for some government policy to kick in when there is a flood. You're not going to wait for somebody from central government to come and help you. You need to be able to do something yourself. Right? Then it goes higher than that to that community, to that region, ultimately to the government, to the continent and globally. And so policies, yes, are important, as are the systems and facilities. You can have all the policies that you want, but if you don't have the means with which to quickly move in and resolve that disaster, those policies are not worth much. Yes, policies are important because they will then open the way for government to provide resources for the disaster preparedness and the disaster risk reduction and the emergency responses, etc. So those policies are essential to enable these things to be done. But like I said, at the end of the day, it is the individual themselves who is vulnerable. And the individual must be empowered to be able to take the appropriate actions. And then government will kick in, whenever they can. But let the individual themselves be the first ones to respond to any potential disaster. And this also applies to the issues of early warning. There are so many systems that are available for early warning. If you go to many people in the villages, they'll tell you, if you see such insects appearing at such time, it means there's going to be flooding, or there's going to be a drought. There's so much of this local knowledge that can be brought on board to help people to anticipate what might happen.